It was a night that paralyzed the heart of America. Streetlights flickered, subways screeched to a halt, and millions were trapped in a darkness so complete it felt almost alive. November 9, 1969, began like any other chilly autumn evening, but by 7:12 p.m., the familiar hum of electricity vanished across New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Families were plunged into shadows, cars stalled in intersections, and the air seemed to vibrate with panic. The blackout wasn't just a power failure, it was a doorway into fear, confusion, and suspicion. Some whispered it was corporate negligence, others feared a hidden government test. Yet even decades later, the truth remained shrouded in mystery, hidden behind redacted documents and conflicting testimonies. The first moments were surreal. In the streets of Manhattan, a young man named David stepped out of his apartment building, expecting to see the usual glow of streetlights. Instead, the block was swallowed in darkness. He fumbled with his flashlight, illuminating the faces of neighbors frozen in disbelief. Car horns blared as drivers hesitated, unsure of the rules in a city suddenly transformed into a maze of shadows. The hum of the subways stopped abruptly, leaving underground commuters stranded and panicked. In a nearby hospital, a nurse named Clara struggled to guide a patient to a backup generator. Emergency protocols kicked in, but the scale of the blackout was overwhelming. People clutched their children, unsure if the darkness would last minutes or hours, as sirens echoed across the empty streets. The chaos was immediate and widespread. Traffic lights failed, causing collisions and gridlocks. Pedestrians stumbled over curbs they couldn't see. Firefighters raced to calls, but were slowed by obstructed streets. Elevators froze mid-shaft, trapping residents who pressed their hands against doors in desperate hope. And yet, the blackout didn't affect all regions uniformly. Some neighborhoods in New Jersey remained fully lit, while parts of Boston experienced rolling outages that lasted nearly 5 hours. Analysts called it a cascading failure in the power grid, triggered by a single transformer overload. But for those who experienced the event firsthand, the pattern seemed too precise to be mere accident. There was a sense of intent lurking behind the randomness, as if the blackout had a hidden purpose that no one could immediately identify. Amid the chaos, ordinary people revealed extraordinary humanity. In Brooklyn, a young boy named Tommy wandered away from his apartment in search of his family, terrified and disoriented. A neighbor, barely older than him, spotted the child and guided him home, ignoring his own fear of the dark. It was instinct, the neighbor said years later. In that darkness, we were all the same. We just needed to survive together. In hospitals, doctors performed emergency procedures by flashlight, while nurses held patients' hands, whispering calm words through trembling voices. Children clung to parents, frightened by the silence of machines that normally hummed reliably, and adults grappled with helplessness in a world temporarily stripped of its modern comforts. The blackout didn't merely disrupt life, it revealed a nation's vulnerability. In office buildings, employees gathered by candlelight, sharing speculation and fear. In subways, passengers communicated using gestures, their usual reliance on automated systems replaced by human ingenuity. Across the East Coast, people confronted not only darkness, but the fragility of infrastructure upon which society had come to depend. The blackout lasted hours, but its psychological impact lingered much longer. Citizens realized that the conveniences they relied upon daily were fragile, susceptible to failure, or perhaps even manipulation. Almost immediately, speculation arose. Journalists rushed to piece together the cause, while utility companies blamed aging equipment and increased electricity demand. Con Edison in New York cited a single transformer failure in Westchester County as the spark that triggered the cascade. Yet critics asked how a solitary failure could plunge multiple cities into darkness simultaneously. Declassified communications years later hinted at unusual activity by military installations coinciding with the blackout,
raising questions that official reports conveniently left unanswered. Some theorized that the blackout was used as cover for secret military experiments, testing communications, electronic warfare, and emergency response under conditions of mass disruption. Others suggested a darker motive entirely: manipulation of financial markets, disruptions timed to influence corporate mergers, or justification for future rate increases. Eyewitnesses recalled odd occurrences that night. In Washington, D.C., government employees noticed military convoys moving through restricted zones. In New York City, residents reported strange, bright flashes in the sky and low-flying aircraft with no official explanation. These sightings, dismissed by some at the time, gained significance when documents released decades later confirmed heightened military activity in the Northeast during the blackout. Internal memos mentioned controlled testing under blackout conditions, but details remained censored. Analysts reviewing the data saw a pattern. The outage may not have been entirely accidental. It was tolerated, orchestrated, or exploited in ways ordinary citizens could never have anticipated. In homes and hospitals alike, personal stories emerged amid the darkness. Families huddled together, sharing food and candles, while neighbors who barely knew one another lent help instinctively. In one Brooklyn apartment, a mother held her children close as she guided them down dim stairwells. In Boston, an elderly man delivered blankets to neighbors without asking for anything in return. These acts of courage and compassion contrasted starkly with the uncertainty surrounding the blackout's cause. People realized that while infrastructure failed, humanity persisted, resilient even in the face of unknown forces manipulating the environment above them. As the night wore on, the blackout exposed not only physical vulnerability, but psychological fragility. Fear, speculation, and rumor spread like wildfire. Some citizens believed the event was orchestrated by shadowy figures in the government. Others thought it might be a test for emergency preparedness. In Philadelphia, one family recounted seeing unmarked vehicles moving through empty streets, their headlights cutting through the darkness, leaving an unsettling trail of questions in their wake. Attempts to investigate were met with bureaucratic obstacles. Journalists who requested detailed utility reports found files delayed or denied. Engineers who spoke publicly were carefully monitored. The blackout, initially explained as infrastructure failure, had become a tangled web of secrecy, suspicion, and human resilience. When power finally returned after nearly 5 hours, the cities were not simply illuminated, they were transformed. Residents stepped back into their apartments, streets, and workplaces, yet many viewed the world differently. The blackout had revealed the invisible systems that kept society running and the ease with which they could be disrupted. For some, the event left a lingering doubt. If electricity, a basic necessity, could be switched off with such precision, what else might be manipulated without their knowledge? The 1969 blackout was more than a power failure. It was a mirror, reflecting both vulnerability and potential malevolence hidden within the structures meant to protect the nation. Decades later, historians and researchers delving into declassified records found tantalizing clues. Communications between utility regulators and the Department of Defense hinted at planned operations during the blackout. Redacted military documents referenced emergency protocol simulations without specifying their nature. A memo noted that testing under controlled blackout conditions could reveal weaknesses in public and private response protocols. Journalists who tirelessly pursued the story uncovered evidence suggesting deliberate obfuscation. Requests for detailed information were stalled or denied. Patterns emerged. Targeted outages, delayed reporting, and military activity hinted at a reality far beyond mere technical failure. The blackout became a symbol not only of infrastructure vulnerability, but also of the tension between secrecy and public accountability. For citizens, the night illuminated both fear and hope. Communities came together to share resources, guide the lost, and comfort the frightened.
Hospitals improvised, parents protected children, and strangers helped one another navigate a world suddenly without guidance. Yet behind the human solidarity lay an unsettling truth. Forces, hidden and powerful, may have orchestrated or exploited the blackout for purposes unknown.
As the blackout stretched on, uncertainty began to breed fear. Streets once familiar turned into labyrinths, shadows stretching and twisting in ways the eye could barely follow. David, the young man from Manhattan, had returned to his apartment to check on his family, but the building itself seemed alien. The elevators were dead, the corridors dark and echoing with the nervous whispers of neighbors. Candles flickered, barely lighting the way, casting dancing silhouettes on the walls. Every shadow seemed to harbor an invisible watcher, an unseen force controlling what should have been a simple power outage. By midnight, rumors began to circulate. Some said the blackout was a test, a simulation orchestrated by agencies whose very existence few dared question. Others claimed it was a punishment, a reminder that power, both electrical and political, could vanish at the whim of forces beyond comprehension. In Brooklyn, Clara, the nurse, recounted how a patient, delirious from shock, muttered that the blackout felt too precise, too deliberate. Even in her professional experience, she admitted, there was something almost mechanical, methodical about the timing and scale. Hospitals were prepared for emergencies, yes, but nothing in protocol could explain the totality, the seamlessness with which the darkness blanketed the cities. Meanwhile, across the region, reports emerged of strange phenomena. Low-flying aircraft were sighted moving in formation above areas already darkened. Residents described seeing bright flashes in the sky, like miniature explosions, followed by a peculiar silence. Military convoys traversed normally restricted streets, their movements unannounced and unexplained. At the time, these sightings were dismissed as coincidental or imaginary, the result of panic and fear. Yet decades later, declassified documents revealed an eerie correlation. Radar logs from the Northeast showed unusual activity during the blackout window. Military communications referenced controlled blackout simulations and electronic stress testing, though the specifics were heavily redacted. In Philadelphia, a man named Robert recounted the moment his neighborhood plunged into darkness. It was immediate, he said. 1 second the street was alive with lights and traffic, the next, silence. And in that silence, you felt watched, like the darkness itself had intent. He described seeing unmarked vehicles moving purposefully through empty streets, vehicles that carried men in uniforms yet did not match any known military branch he had seen. Local authorities offered no explanation at the time, and newspapers reported the blackout as a technical failure. But the discrepancy between official reports and what citizens experienced sowed seeds of suspicion that would linger for decades. In the quiet of a Boston apartment, an elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, clutched her grandchildren close. She spoke of the eerie calm that followed the initial chaos, the way people moved cautiously, whispering, unsure if they were safe. In that moment, she realized how reliant they were on systems they never questioned, the lights, the elevators, the phones. And now, stripped of all safety, humanity's resilience was the only thing keeping them grounded. Her story, like many others, highlighted a striking truth. The blackout was not just a failure of infrastructure, but a mirror reflecting the vulnerability of modern life. As night deepened, more anomalies surfaced. Communications lines, supposedly inactive due to the blackout, showed evidence of activity. Amateur radio operators reported receiving strange, intelligible signals, sometimes in bursts, sometimes continuous, originating from unknown sources. Engineers investigating the post-blackout reports found inconsistencies in data logs. Transformers and substations showed no signs of permanent failure. Circuits that should have burned out seemed untouched, as if they had been intentionally deactivated and reactivated. At the heart of this mystery was a single question: who had the capability to orchestrate such a coordinated blackout? Many historians point to the convergence of private corporations and government agencies as the only entities with sufficient resources. The Cold War context added layers of intrigue. 1969 was a time of high tension, nuclear anxiety, and relentless technological competition. Governments around the world were conducting secret tests, and the U.S. military was deeply involved in projects that remained classified. Could the blackout have been part of such an experiment, a way to test urban resilience and communication networks under controlled chaos? In homes across the cities, human drama unfolded in parallel with these unanswered questions. In Manhattan, a young couple, Linda and Mark, were trapped in a high-rise elevator for nearly an hour. The air grew thick with panic, but in the darkness they discovered an unexpected intimacy, holding each other close as if the uncertainty of survival forged a bond stronger than any previous affection. Meanwhile, on the streets below, strangers came together to help elderly neighbors navigate the chaos. Children, frightened by the silence, clung to adults whose own fear had to be set aside to provide comfort. Acts of compassion and bravery contrasted sharply with the underlying suspicion that the blackout was no accident. By the early morning hours, emergency crews began restoring order, yet the questions remained. Utilities insisted the cause was a transformer overload, a cascading failure. Yet every engineer, every analyst who revisited the case found the same anomalies: selective outages, rapid restoration in some areas, unexplained phenomena reported by civilians and military personnel alike. The blackout had left behind a trail of mystery, a set of breadcrumbs that would fuel decades of investigation. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence emerged years later when a group of journalists digging through declassified military documents uncovered memos indicating controlled tests under blackout conditions. The memos suggested that the government had a keen interest in monitoring civilian behavior during mass disruptions, studying emergency response and societal reaction. The language was deliberately vague, but the implications were chilling. The blackout was not simply an accident, but a live experiment conducted on millions of unsuspecting citizens. In Philadelphia, Robert recalled a neighbor whispering a theory that night that the blackout was a warning, a demonstration of power meant to remind the public of who truly controlled the city's lifelines. At first, Robert dismissed it as paranoia, yet in hindsight, he acknowledged a certain resonance in the thought. The blackout, after all, was precise, targeted, and followed a pattern that defied simple explanation. From transformer failures to unexplained aerial activity, every element pointed towards orchestration. Meanwhile, communities demonstrated remarkable resilience. Churches opened their doors, providing light, warmth, and food. Neighbors shared whatever resources they had: flashlights, candles, blankets, even companionship. These acts of solidarity were humanity's answer to an invisible, potentially malevolent force. In hospitals, doctors and nurses improvised under candlelight, performing delicate procedures with unmatched focus. The blackout became both a trial and a revelation, exposing the fragility of technology while highlighting the strength of human spirit. As the sun began to rise, a tentative sense of normalcy returned. Streets buzzed with the hum of electricity, and elevators once again carried residents to their apartments. But the psychological impact endured. People had glimpsed a world without the infrastructure they depended upon, a world in which they were entirely vulnerable. And though official reports would soon downplay the event as a technical failure, for those who lived through it, the memory of shadows, strange lights, and inexplicable activity persisted. Years later, when historians and investigative journalists revisited the case, the blackout revealed itself as more than a simple accident. Declassified communications between utility companies and military installations suggested premeditation. Redacted military files referenced controlled simulations during the blackout, and FCC reports hinted at irregular monitoring. Engineers noted inconsistencies in equipment logs. Circuits that should have failed were intact. Transformers that should have exploded remained undamaged.
The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, yet together they suggested an unsettling conclusion. The 1969 blackout had elements of a controlled experiment, a test on the American public that left fear, confusion, and questions in its wake. And within this tapestry of speculation, human stories continued to shine. In Brooklyn, Tommy, the boy guided home by a neighbor, later became a firefighter himself, inspired by the courage and kindness he had witnessed. In Manhattan, David and his family, though shaken, grew closer, forever bound by the night they navigated darkness together. In hospitals, nurses and doctors carried the lessons of improvisation and compassion throughout their careers, teaching new generations that humanity often thrives in moments of chaos. The blackout also served as a harrowing lesson in trust. Citizens realized that infrastructure, often taken for granted, could be manipulated or fail at any moment. The possibility of intentional orchestration introduced a shadow of doubt. What other systems, financial, governmental, or military, might be controlled behind closed doors? The event became a touchstone for conspiracy
theorists, a subject of documentaries, books, and relentless curiosity. The darkness of 1969 had been literal, but its echoes illuminated far more. The fragility of systems, the potential for hidden agendas, and the enduring strength of human solidarity in crisis. The days after the blackout were surreal. Cities had returned to their familiar hum, the lights flickered back on, and streets thrummed with life once more. But the memory of darkness lingered, like a shadow refusing to vanish. Citizens spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen, about the strange vehicles, the unexplainable lights, the silence that carried more weight than mere absence of sound. The blackout had left a mark not only on infrastructure, but on consciousness itself, a reminder that the world people believed controlled could be turned against them, perhaps intentionally. David walked through Manhattan, still shaken by the night's events. He passed streets that looked familiar but felt alien, their normalcy a fragile veil over the chaos he had witnessed. Conversations in cafes and offices revolved around speculation. Some whispered of corporate malfeasance, blaming Con Edison and other utility companies for negligence. Others murmured about government tests, a controlled experiment to assess urban response and societal behavior. The notion of a deliberate orchestration haunted him. How could a transformer failure cause such precise, wide-reaching disruption? The question gnawed at the mind of anyone who had lived through it. Meanwhile, investigations began, some public, some quietly internal. Journalists filed stories, yet most were dismissed as exaggerations or unverified accounts. Yet declassified communications and memos surfaced over the years, hinting at a far more sinister truth. Military installations in the Northeast had conducted unusual operations on the night of the blackout. Memos referenced stress testing of public infrastructure under simulated blackout conditions, but specifics were redacted. Amateur radio enthusiasts reported strange transmissions that night, some in codes that have never been fully deciphered. Each fragment of information, seemingly isolated, began forming a pattern too coherent to ignore. In Boston, Mrs. Patterson reflected on the night with a mixture of awe and fear. Her grandchildren had slept fitfully, frightened by shadows and sirens. The elderly woman, however, had observed moments of quiet heroism. Neighbors she barely knew helped one another navigate stairwells and darkened streets, sharing food, blankets, and encouragement. It was humanity's instinct to respond to uncertainty with solidarity. And yet, beneath this communal resilience lay a gnawing suspicion. If darkness could be imposed so completely, so systematically, who or what had done it? Across the East Coast, reports of odd aerial phenomena continued to surface. Low-flying aircraft, bright flashes in the sky, and unexplained movement of vehicles had initially been dismissed. Yet later evidence suggested these were not mere coincidences.
Radar logs confirmed unusual activity coinciding with the blackout, while communications between utility regulators and military authorities mentioned controlled testing under blackout conditions. Analysts reviewing the documents noted the precise timing of outages, selective regional impacts, and rapid restorations in areas that should have experienced longer delays. The blackout no longer appeared accidental. Robert in Philadelphia recalled walking through his darkened neighborhood, the chill of November night biting at his face. Street lights out, shops shuttered, and homes enveloped in shadows. He felt the kind of vulnerability one only experiences when a city loses its familiar hum. "I felt watched," he said years later. "It wasn't fear of criminals or accidents. It was the sense of being observed, like the night itself was designed to teach us a lesson." His neighbor had whispered theories of manipulation, of tests, of warnings, but Robert then had dismissed it. Now, reviewing the declassified documents decades later, he realized his intuition had been correct. The blackout had layers, and some were deliberately hidden from the public. Amid the growing speculation, individual tragedies unfolded. In Brooklyn, a man named Samuel lost his elderly father that night because an hospital elevator failed. The emergency generator kicked in, but not quickly enough, and Samuel would spend years haunted by the memory. He became determined to uncover the truth, filing Freedom of Information requests, digging through records, and piecing together what little evidence existed. His journey would mirror that of countless others seeking clarity, frustration at bureaucracy, obstacles in accessing documents, and subtle intimidation that suggested someone did not want the truth fully exposed. In Manhattan, David's apartment building had been plunged into darkness, forcing neighbors to cooperate in ways they never imagined. Families shared resources, strangers guided one another, and children found security in the hands of adults they barely knew. It was a crucible of human resilience, yet for every story of hope, there were stories of desperation. People fell, became sick, or suffered panic attacks. The blackout was both a test and a trauma, highlighting the fragility of life when the systems people depended on failed or were disrupted intentionally. The military angle became more compelling as journalists uncovered additional documents. A memo from the Department of Defense communications officer referenced simulated blackouts to test citywide response mechanisms and emphasized the importance of monitoring civilian behavior. While intentionally vague, the language suggested that public safety may not have been the primary objective. Observers speculated that the blackout provided a unique opportunity to analyze how densely populated urban areas would react to large-scale, sudden disruptions, possibly informing policies, infrastructure designs, or covert operations in future crises. In the weeks following the blackout, conspiracy theories flourished. Citizens connected dots between odd occurrences, unexplained aircraft sightings, delayed public communications, and anomalies in power infrastructure. While utility companies insisted the outage was a simple technical failure, the timing of certain events, coinciding with military exercises and secret testing, began to look increasingly intentional. Patterns emerged suggesting a carefully orchestrated event rather than a random accident. Human stories continued to anchor the narrative in reality. Clara, the nurse, remembered a young boy trapped in the hospital elevator. She held his hand and whispered stories to keep him calm, her own heart racing. David recalled his neighbor in Manhattan who guided children and elderly residents down dark stairwells. Mrs. Patterson reflected on the courage of ordinary citizens stepping forward to help one another. Each story was a reminder that in the midst of fear and uncertainty, humanity could shine brighter than any light temporarily stolen by the blackout. As months turned into years, the blackout maintained a mysterious allure. Historians revisiting the event pieced together communications between utility regulators, military installations, and government agencies. The memos indicated pre-planned exercises conducted under conditions of simulated failure. Radar and aircraft logs confirmed the presence of unusual activity. Some engineers reviewing old power grid data noticed inconsistencies that suggested selective deactivation of circuits. Collectively, these findings painted a picture of an event far more complex than the public had been told. Meanwhile, the emotional toll lingered. Survivors recounted how the blackout had reshaped their understanding of vulnerability, dependence, and trust. Families learned how quickly normalcy could collapse. Communities discovered the latent strength of cooperation. For some, the experience inspired lifelong dedication to public service, safety, or journalism. For others, it seeded lifelong suspicion and anxiety about unseen powers manipulating everyday life. The blackout was no longer a story of electricity. It had become a story of control, resilience, and human spirit confronting forces beyond comprehension. Even as decades passed, researchers continued to uncover traces of the event's deeper implications. Declassified military communications suggested not only observation, but behavioral analysis. Emergency response protocols were evaluated, recorded, and sometimes modified based on what was observed during those dark hours. This introduced ethical debates. Could millions of civilians unknowingly participate in a controlled experiment without consent? Could fear and chaos, human suffering and disruption be justified as scientific observation or national security exercise? The answers remained ambiguous, leaving a haunting sense of unease. Stories of individual heroism persisted. Samuel, who lost his father, dedicated his life to transparency and accountability in city infrastructure. David's experience in Manhattan inspired him to volunteer for local emergency services. Clara, the nurse, trained future generations in improvisation during crises. Even Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren, once terrified, carried forward lessons of empathy, courage, and the value of community support during emergencies. Human endurance
And kindness provided a stark counterpoint to the dark possibilities suggested by conspiratorial threads and redacted documents. The blackout of 1969 became more than a historical footnote. It was a case study in infrastructure vulnerability, a cautionary tale about reliance on systems that could fail or be manipulated, and a canvas for stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Each revelation, each declassified memo, each first-hand account added layers to a narrative that remained unresolved in many respects. The darkness had receded physically, but its psychological and historical impact endured, influencing perceptions of government, corporations, and civic responsibility. The following months after the blackout were filled with quiet unease. People returned to their routines, the streets hummed with electricity once again, and life appeared normal. Yet, beneath the veneer of everyday life, shadows of that night lingered. Citizens who had experienced the blackout carried a persistent sense of vulnerability, a subtle fear that systems designed to serve them might be manipulated by forces they could never fully understand. The simple act of flipping a light switch had transformed from routine to ritual of cautious gratitude. David, now more aware of the eerie precision of the blackout, began obsessively reviewing news articles, government statements, and declassified records that trickled out over the years. He discovered inconsistencies, subtle contradictions, and hints of deliberate omission. Utility reports claimed a cascading transformer failure, yet internal logs suggested certain circuits had been intentionally shut down and restarted. Military memos vaguely referenced controlled testing under blackout conditions, and radar logs indicated unusual flights over urban centers during the outage. It was a puzzle with pieces scattered across decades, but together they formed a chilling pattern. The blackout had layers of intent hidden beneath its apparent chaos. In Philadelphia, Robert continued his quest for answers. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests, delved into archives, and interviewed engineers and former military personnel. Each revelation added weight to his suspicions. One engineer, speaking off the record, admitted that the pattern of outages did not align with a simple technical failure. Another revealed that in simulations of power failures, the 1969 blackout's precision could only have been achieved through deliberate orchestration. Robert began to see the blackout as an elaborate experiment, one that had tested not only infrastructure, but the public psyche, revealing how people responded to fear, chaos, and uncertainty. The emotional toll of these discoveries was profound. Samuel, who had lost his father during the blackout, read about these revelations with a mix of sorrow and vindication. The man had suspected intentional manipulation for years, but the evidence now seemed to confirm his worst fears. The realization that human lives had been silently subjected to an experiment for purposes unknown stirred rage and grief, yet also a determination to preserve the stories of those who suffered, lest history forget them. In Manhattan, David met Clara at a conference about urban emergency response, where former survivors shared experiences and insights. Clara recounted stories of children terrified in dimly lit hospitals, families trapped in elevators, and neighbors guiding one another through darkened streets. David shared his research into declassified documents and radar logs. Together, they pieced together fragments of truth. They began to suspect that the blackout was a convergence of opportunism and experimentation, a deliberate act disguised as accident, shaped to extract maximum information about human behavior while advancing political and financial agendas. The discovery of unusual communications sent a ripple of shock through the investigative community. Amateur radio operators had documented strange transmissions during the blackout, pulses and bursts that bore no resemblance to ordinary emergency signals. Some suggested the transmissions were coded instructions, possibly guiding movements of military personnel or monitoring key infrastructure nodes. David and Robert hypothesized that civilians had unknowingly been participants in a live experiment, observed and analyzed as if the blackout were a laboratory. The ethical implications were staggering. Millions of people had experienced fear, disruption, and even loss of life, all while unaware they were part of a controlled environment. Meanwhile, personal tragedies and acts of heroism continued to intertwine. Samuel, reflecting on the night he lost his father, found solace in stories of compassion. In Brooklyn, a young mother guided a neighbor's children to safety, showing courage and calm beyond her years. In hospitals, doctors improvised surgeries by candlelight, nurses soothed panicked patients, and strangers in the streets shared food and blankets. The darkness had revealed the fragility of technology, yes, but it also illuminated humanity at its best. Even amid chaos, kindness and resilience shone brightly, a counterpoint to the shadowy forces manipulating the city. By the time the first anniversary of the blackout approached, investigative reports began to emerge. Journalists and historians had pieced together a narrative suggesting that the blackout was part of a series of deliberate experiments designed to test urban infrastructure and civilian response under extreme conditions. Internal memos referenced emergency protocol assessments, while military documents detailed exercises that coincided precisely with the blackout. Yet the public record remained sanitized, portraying the event as a technical failure. Those who remembered the night knew better. They had felt the orchestrated precision, the unseen hand guiding the chaos, and the eerie coordination that defied natural explanation. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Survivors wrestled with the duality of the blackout. On one hand, a traumatic disruption that caused fear and suffering. On the other, a revelation of humanity's resilience. Families and communities bonded in the darkness. Strangers became guides and protectors, and children discovered courage they never knew they possessed. The blackout, intended or not, had become a crucible of human character. As David and Robert dug deeper, more shocking evidence surfaced. Utility engineers admitted in confidential interviews that certain circuits had been intentionally deactivated. Military personnel, no longer bound by secrecy, hinted at exercises conducted under the guise of national security. Radar logs confirmed unusual flights and low-altitude maneuvers precisely timed with the blackout's progression. Each revelation added weight to the theory that the blackout was more than an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated convergence of technical control, military testing, and social observation. The realization struck many as a moral and ethical reckoning. Citizens had been manipulated, tested, and observed without consent. Lives had been endangered. Yet amid the outrage, a pattern of karma and consequence emerged. Those who had shown courage and compassion in the dark were remembered, celebrated, and revered. Samuel, inspired by loss, dedicated himself to advocacy for transparency and safety. Clara trained generations of nurses to handle emergencies creatively. David became a chronicler of the blackout, ensuring that the stories of resilience and fear would not be forgotten. The darkness, orchestrated or accidental, left a lasting imprint on the psyche of a nation. In Philadelphia, Robert confronted former officials who had overseen communications during the blackout. Some admitted to observing patterns of civilian behavior, testing response strategies, and studying societal reactions. Yet when questioned about the morality of conducting such experiments without public knowledge, responses were evasive. It became clear that the blackout had served multiple purposes: technical, military, psychological, and political. The event had revealed vulnerabilities, tested human endurance, and provided data that would remain classified for decades. Across the East Coast, the stories of everyday heroism persisted. Families navigated darkened streets, strangers guided each other through darkened streets, giving each word of whispered reassurance a beacon against the orchestrated chaos that loomed above. The blackout had been both a trial and a revelation, leaving a legacy of lessons, sorrow, resilience, and ultimately, hope.
Years passed, but the shadow of the blackout never fully lifted. Citizens who had lived through that night carried the memory like an unhealed wound. Every time a power flickered, every time a citywide alert sounded, that memory returned, an echo of uncertainty and fear, mingled with the unshakable sense that unseen forces had manipulated their lives. David, now a chronicler of the blackout, had amassed a collection of stories, documents, and interviews that painted a far darker picture than the official narrative. One evening, he sifted through newly declassified memos that hinted at coordination between utility companies and military research units. A line in one of the reports sent chills down his spine. Controlled outage approved. Civilian behavior under observation. Exercise objectives met. The words were clinical, almost cold, describing the manipulation of millions of people as if they were mere test subjects. In Philadelphia, Robert discovered similar evidence. He obtained interviews with retired engineers who confirmed the unusual patterns of circuit shutdowns. Radar logs corroborated eyewitness accounts of low-flying military aircraft that evening. Signals picked up by amateur radio operators were matched to encrypted military communications, some of which contained instructions that mirrored the blackout's progression. The evidence converged on a staggering conclusion. The blackout had been at least partially orchestrated. It had been an experiment in control, observation, and manipulation, carried out on unsuspecting civilians. The shocking truth ignited a wave of ethical outrage. Scholars, journalists, and citizens debated the morality of such actions. Was national security justification enough to conduct a psychological experiment on millions? Could fear, disruption, and potential loss of life be acceptable collateral for data collection? The questions haunted survivors and investigators alike, challenging the very notions of trust between government and citizen. Amid these revelations, the human stories shone brighter than ever. Clara, recalling her experiences as a nurse, continued to teach new generations how to handle emergencies without relying solely on technology. Samuel, who had lost his father, transformed grief into advocacy, pushing for transparency and infrastructure safety reforms. David chronicled these stories, ensuring that the courage, kindness, and resilience displayed during the blackout would be remembered alongside the darker truths. These narratives provided balance. While humans could be subjected to control and manipulation, their innate compassion and solidarity were forces no experiment could suppress. In Manhattan, a reunion of survivors brought to light personal tales that had remained hidden for decades. Neighbors who had guided children down stairwells, families who had shared food and blankets, and strangers who had improvised assistance in hospitals gathered to recount their experiences. The gathering was both cathartic and revelatory. Survivors realized that the blackout had forged bonds, instilled courage, and revealed facets of human nature that might never have emerged under ordinary circumstances. Yet the conspiracy's reach became even more disturbing as David uncovered documents that indicated financial interests may have been entwined. Some corporations, involved in mergers and utility operations, stood to gain from the blackout or from subsequent regulatory decisions. Selective outages, rapid restoration in certain areas, and obfuscation of true causes suggested manipulation that went beyond mere testing. The blackout, once seen as a technical failure, revealed itself as a nexus of political, corporate, and military interests, all converging under the cover of darkness. As the climax of Revelations approached, Robert and David made a startling connection. The blackout's orchestration appeared meticulously planned to test not only infrastructure but social behavior. By observing panic, cooperation, and improvisation, the architects of the event gathered psychological data on millions of unsuspecting individuals. Citizens had been unwitting participants in a vast social experiment, their responses analyzed for years to come. The realization was both horrifying and mesmerizing. Millions had been subjects of manipulation without consent, yet their humanity had shone through in countless acts of courage and kindness. The night of November 9, 1969, thus took on new meaning. The darkness was no longer merely an absence of light, it became a symbol of control, secrecy, and moral ambiguity. But it was also a testament to resilience. Children guided by strangers, families united by fear, neighbors assisting one another. All these acts created a counterforce against the shadowy intentions that loomed behind the blackout. Humanity, in this context, was the ultimate revelation. Even under manipulation, empathy, courage, and solidarity endured. David and Robert, in collaboration with historians, published their findings, revealing the hidden layers of the blackout to a wider audience. The response was mixed. Some were outraged by the ethical breaches, some inspired by the stories of human resilience, and others stunned into disbelief. Scholars debated the ramifications. If governments could manipulate citizens without consent for observation, what limits existed on power, secrecy, and civil liberties? The blackout became not only a historical case study, but a moral and philosophical inquiry into the intersection of authority, control, and human spirit. Personal karma and realization threaded through these narratives. Samuel, having transformed personal tragedy into advocacy, experienced a sense of purpose he had never known. David found that chronicling the blackout brought him closer to the community, forging connections that spanned generations. Clara, continuing her work in emergency response, instilled lessons of compassion and improvisation in countless healthcare professionals. These individual journeys reflected a larger truth. Even amid manipulation, cruelty, and darkness, human resilience could create light, meaning, and hope. Meanwhile, the shadows of the orchestrators began to dissipate over time. Retired officials, engineers, and military personnel, no longer constrained by secrecy, provided testimonies and confirmations of what had transpired. The meticulous control over the blackout was acknowledged, quietly if not publicly. Civilian lives, once unknowingly subjected to experimentation, were finally recognized as having endured extraordinary circumstances with dignity, bravery, and compassion. In a final twist of realization, the survivors and researchers concluded that the blackout was both a failure and a revelation.
A failure of transparency, ethics, and protection, yes, but also a revelation of human strength, community, and courage under pressure. By the time the 50th anniversary of the blackout arrived, the stories had been told, studied, and memorialized. Public awareness, documentaries, and commemorative events ensured that the lessons, both technical and moral, were preserved. The blackout remained a cautionary tale about infrastructure vulnerability, governmental secrecy, and corporate complicity, yet it became a celebration of human spirit. Survivors shared their experiences, scholars analyzed the evidence, and ordinary citizens remembered how courage and kindness had illuminated the darkest hours. The hidden conspiracy behind the 1969 blackout had been partially revealed, the orchestration acknowledged in fragments, yet the ethical questions persisted. Could such manipulation ever be justified? Should citizens trust systems that could be controlled without consent? The event had exposed vulnerabilities in both infrastructure and society, leaving a legacy that combined awe, fear, and inspiration. And amid all this, one truth remained unassailable. Human courage, empathy, and solidarity had triumphed over darkness, both literal and metaphorical, leaving a legacy far more enduring than the blackout itself.
The decades that followed the 1969 blackout carried an enduring shadow, a quiet reminder of that one night when millions of lives were unexpectedly held hostage by darkness. Yet over time, the event became more than a story of fear and confusion. It transformed into a narrative of resilience, courage, and revelation. Survivors, researchers, and historians pieced together a mosaic of truth, where fragments of conspiracy met threads of humanity. And in that intersection, the full picture of the blackout began to emerge. David, now older and weathered by years of investigation, sat in his Manhattan office reviewing archival footage and testimonies. Every image, every written account seemed to pulse with life, capturing both the terror of the moment and the unexpected heroism it had inspired. Street corners once shadowed with fear were now remembered for acts of kindness, strangers guiding lost children, families sharing blankets and candles, neighbors navigating stairwells together. In compiling these stories, David realized that the true legacy of the blackout was not the manipulation, the secrecy, or the orchestrated chaos. It was the enduring strength of the human spirit in response. Robert, in Philadelphia, reflected on the implications of what he had uncovered. The blackout was more than a technical failure. It was a controlled experiment, a deliberate observation of urban populations, a convergence of corporate, governmental, and military interests. Yet the ethical lessons were undeniable. Humanity had been tested without consent, yet individuals had risen to the occasion. Communities had functioned as lifelines where technology had failed. And in that contrast lay the paradox. Even under manipulation, compassion and courage could not be suppressed. Samuel, having survived personal tragedy, continued to champion transparency and safety. His father's death, once a source of anger and grief, became a catalyst for advocacy. Hospitals and emergency systems were upgraded, infrastructure was scrutinized more rigorously, and public awareness campaigns emphasized preparedness and vigilance. His journey illustrated the transformative power of channeling loss into action, turning grief into enduring change that benefited future generations. Clara, whose experiences as a nurse had exposed her to the most vulnerable during the blackout, trained countless healthcare professionals in emergency improvisation. Her teachings emphasized adaptability, calm under pressure, and the preservation of human dignity amidst chaos. Technology can fail, she often reminded her students, but humanity never should. Her words became guiding principles, passed down like a torch, ensuring that the lessons of that night extended beyond those who had directly experienced it. In cities across the East Coast, the anniversary of the blackout became a time of reflection. Documentaries recounted stories of fear, loss, and resilience. Commemorative events highlighted the courage of ordinary citizens who had become heroes overnight. Streets once darkened were now illuminated with memory, storytelling, and understanding. Even the youngest generations, who had only known the blackout through history books and accounts, felt its impact, learning lessons of vigilance, compassion, and communal strength. The conspiracy, while partially revealed, continued to evoke debate. Retired officials and engineers spoke cautiously about their roles, confirming coordination between military and utility operations, yet intentions were framed as research, testing, and preparedness. Yet the morality of such experiments remained contentious. Could millions of civilians be observed without consent? Was fear and disruption justified for the sake of data? The answers were complex, morally gray, and unresolved in public discourse. But for those who had lived through the event, the questions mattered less than the truths they had discovered within themselves, the courage, empathy, and solidarity that had defined their night in darkness. David and Robert collaborated on a final comprehensive account, weaving together eyewitness narratives, technical analyses, declassified documents, and ethical reflections. They highlighted the dual nature of the blackout, the deliberate orchestration that had imposed fear and chaos, and the spontaneous emergence of human resilience and compassion that had defied it. It was a story of control and freedom, of manipulation and choice, of darkness and light. The blackout had tested the nation, and the nation had responded, not with despair, but with courage and humanity. Communities remembered the night not only for the fear it imposed, but for the bonds it created. Families reunited, neighbors continued to support one another, and citizens remained vigilant about the fragility of infrastructure and the potential for hidden manipulation. Lessons learned from 1969 shaped policy, emergency preparedness, and public consciousness for generations. Every candlelit stairwell, every shared blanket, and every whispered reassurance became emblematic of a deeper truth, that even in the face of orchestrated darkness, the light of human compassion could never be extinguished. By the time the 50th anniversary approached, the legacy of the blackout had crystallized into both cautionary tale and celebration. Historians published analyses, journalists recounted stories, and public forums debated ethics, infrastructure, and societal resilience. The blackout remained a reminder of vulnerability, secrecy, and potential manipulation, but also a testament to endurance, courage, and hope. It had revealed the worst of manipulation and the best of humanity, sometimes simultaneously, leaving an indelible mark on the national consciousness. As the sun rose over New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, D.C., it illuminated streets that had once been shrouded in darkness. The people who had endured that night carried the lessons forward: vigilance, compassion, community, and an awareness that ordinary citizens could face extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary courage. The hidden conspiracy of 1969 remained partially revealed, but the stories of resilience, ethical reflection, and enduring hope had become visible, enduring, and immortalized. The blackout was no longer merely an event, it was a legacy. It had tested systems, observed citizens, and challenged ethical boundaries, but it had also revealed the profound depth of human spirit. From tragedy emerged purpose, from fear emerged courage, and from darkness emerged light. The night of November 9, 1969, had been terrifying, mysterious, and morally complex, but above all, it had been a testament to humanity. And so the story ends not in darkness, but in reflection, of secrets uncovered, lives changed, and a nation reminded that while forces beyond understanding may manipulate events, the light of human resilience, empathy, and courage shines far brighter than any blackout.
Uncover the secrets they don't want you to know. Subscribe and follow to dive into untold history.